Hi there.
Hi there. Welcome to this presentation on the artistic and cultural life in Paris.
We will take you on a journey from Roman times up to the 20th century.
There are two parts to this presentation, and you can find them both on YouTube.
And you can find information on my website, which is Artamica.
Enjoy!
Enjoy. There are bits and pieces of Roman times which still exist in France, and you can actually sit on a wall that is 2,000 years old, and maybe Julius Caesar sat on it before you. There was discovered an old part of the wall, and they actually decided to mark it in the road. You see here where I've put the two red lines.
As you can see, the past is very present here.
This is just to the south of the island. The Romans built this arena. It was huge in those days. I think it could hold about 15,000 people. There would be, everything you'd expect in a Roman arena. They had gladiators, they had wild animals. These days, all you can see are tourists.
Unless you spend nice time at a night cafe somewhere in Paris, and after a few drinks, maybe you will also see the gladiators again.
Maybe you could be a gladiator after that, yes. We've skipped almost 1,000 years. We're moving forward now to when the kings started to appear in France.
And here we have Hugo Capet, and he was the first elected king of the Franks. He proposed that the throne was not a hereditary right, but that the king should be the best man for the job. So he was elected, and the dynasty he established ruled France for about 300 years. After ascending to the throne, Hugh Capet arranged for coronation of his own son, Robert, and so on and so on. So much for elected kings.
There's a very nice story about Hugo. It's said that he recovered the relics of Saint Valerie, which had been stolen, and he put them back where they were supposed to be. And then in a dream, Saint Valerie actually appeared to him and said, well, thanks very much, that's very nice, and in exchange, your descendants will be kings until the 7th generation. So when Hugo Capet was crowned, he did a rather sneaky thing. He decided that he wouldn't take the title of king, because that way his successors would be kings until the 8th generation.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that brings us to Philippe Auguste.
A very important king, because his predecessors were known as the king of the Franks, and he was the first king of France. Philip transformed France from a small feudal state into the most powerful country in Europe. He granted privileges and liberties to the emerging bourgeois class. He also built the famous wall, which you can still see in Paris.
There are still some remains of that wall of Philippe Auguste. Today, it is used as a school playground. There was no attempt made even to pull down some of the ruins of the wall. So as you can see here, the houses, which were built, within the last 100 years probably, were just built against these old ruins of a tower.
Very economical.
Very economical.
It's not easy to find old buildings in Paris and actually in any European big cities, because old buildings were usually destroyed either by fire because of the density in the big cities, and often just to make room for new buildings, so-called modern buildings. So we are very lucky that we have a few medieval buildings preserved in Paris by some miracle. So big cities like Paris, London are not the best for medieval architecture enthusiasts like me.
Here's another of the old buildings in Paris. Actually, this is reputed to be the oldest stone house in Paris, and it is known that it was the house of Nicolas Flamel. Now, probably you thought that Nicolas Flamel was an invention of the Harry Potter series. Not at all. He was a real person. He was...
An alchemist?
No, not an alchemist. That's the legend that grew up about him, actually shortly after he died. He was a scribe, he was a manuscript seller. He did very well. He married a rich person. They were reputed to give a lot of money to the church, to the poor. This particular house actually was for destitute people to live. He never lived there himself, but he built it specifically for people who had nowhere else to go. Let's leave the centre of Paris for the moment and wend our way, probably about 2 kilometres north, and we'll find ourselves in front of the Basilica of Saint-Denis.
It's a very important church because the new style in architecture, the Gothic style, was born here. At that time, of course, it wasn't called the Gothic style, it was called the French style.
It should be called the Parisian style, shouldn't it?
It could be. It was born in Paris, or just north of Paris. The Gothic style, it was a pejorative term invented by the Renaissance architects, simply meaning barbarian, non-classical.
Yeah, Gothic, I always have a problem with this term Gothic. They weren't barbarians, of course. They were just a tribe. They came from the east. They invaded, I believe, Rome at first, yeah. Because they were different, everybody said, they're barbarians.
Barbarians, non-classical, very biased view. But here we go. Gothic is a wonderful style, and we will see a lot of Gothic structures here in this presentation.
This is where French royalty and French kings were buried.
So no wonder that the abbot of Saint-Denis wanted the best of the best for this church, the very important church, when he decided to rebuild it in the early Middle Ages.
You know, when we refer to the Middle Ages, it has a bad reputation, doesn't it? But it did oversee its fair share of innovations.
A lot. In architecture, for example, which we will see for the first time at Saint-Denis, pointed arches and ribbed vaults were used.
Pointed arches as opposed to
rounded arches.
Rounded arches, yeah, okay. Rounded arches, which were the previous types of arch, they're less efficient because the rounding means you're tending to push the walls apart. Pointed arches were tending to push the walls downwards and not apart, so down into the ground. Therefore, they were less prone to falling down.
Yes, therefore you could build higher churches, thin walls, and it allowed for large openings, especially for stained glass windows.
You mentioned ribbed vaults.
Ribbed vaults, very important architectural innovation. There was a web built of heavy stone, but between the ribs, lighter material could be used. Therefore, again, the building could be stronger and higher. So as you can see here at Saint-Denis, the first pointed arches here, those windows were very important. They're not only beautiful, but they also have symbolic meaning. They allowed a lot of light, and light means the presence of the divine. For Abbot Suger, it was very important that he could use those big stained glass windows because he associated this kind of architecture with the presence of the divine.
You said it allowed him to use stained glass, but of course he could have used plain glass throughout. Was stained glass a new thing, or...?
It wasn't really new, it's an old technique, but stained glass is important because each window could tell a story.
Exactly, yes. It's telling the story.
So there were biblical characters in those windows. There were Old Testament, New Testament stories, the prophets, the kings, and so on.
And let's say as well that stained glass is, for the congregation, stained glass is vastly more interesting than a bunch of plain windows.
Yes, and it was called the Bible for the poor, because we have to remember that most of the people couldn't read, so they could see the stories in pictures.
Okay. When we talk about Saint-Denis, we have to talk about the Abbot Suger.
Abbot Suger was not an architect, but he had a vision and he could write. So he wrote extensively about his idea, what this building should look like. He had at least 2 master masons who enabled those bold innovations.
Unfortunately, he never mentioned their names, even though he did write extensively, so we have no idea who his masons were.
His name, on the other hand, is all over the building.
In stained glass, on the columns.
Perfect example of medieval marketing.
All right.
Let's go back to Paris to see Notre Dame.
Before we go, there's one other thing I just want to point out. Saint-Denis It's a tall building, of course, so its walls have to be, well, buttressed. They have these huge pieces of stone, you can see them here, holding those walls up. The stone, of course, is it's vertically against the wall. It's like your tomatoes. You want to hold your tomatoes up, so you put a stake. That is exactly what these buttresses are doing. Goodbye, Saint-Denis. Let's go down to Notre Dame. Before we actually get to look at the cathedral building, take a look at this. I'm sure a lot of you say, oh yes, these are gargoyles. Well, actually no, they're called grotesques. Here's the gargoyle there, because Notre Dame has gargoyles as well. And there's a fascinating difference. A grotesque it's just what it says. It's something which looks villainous, and the idea was that evil spirits will be held at bay outside by the grotesque. A gargoyle, on the other hand, has a very specific function. It is going to take the rainwater on the roof, and it's going to be channeled down the gargoyle and then allowed to fall to the ground. But it'll be a long way from the wall, so the rainwater won't damage the structure. So here you can see the grotesque on the tower. They're all around the towers. And if we just go a little bit underneath, there you can see gargoyles.
Well, the interesting thing here is they are not really medieval. Probably there were medieval gargoyles there. I'm sure they were. But they were destroyed. So those are 19th century inventions by the 19th century architect.
The architect Viollet-le-Duc, I think.
Yes.
We'll talk about his additions in a moment, but let's first look at the buttresses on Notre Dame.
Actually, you shouldn't call them buttresses.
They're flying, aren't they?
They're flying buttresses.
Because that's what they look like they're doing, flying buttresses. This is a fascinating innovation, which is really prominent on
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame, thank you. The idea here is that the buttress, where it touches the wall, will take the weight pushing down at that point, and it'll move that force further away from the wall. The advantage of this is that it's very slim, it's very small, it actually looks very elegant. We don't have tomato plants here. What we've got here is like a piece of wood which is propping your door open.
Looks very elegant.
Does.
And it's very functional.
Very functional, very elegant. They became a staple in Gothic architecture, of course, and they started around, I think, the 12th century, was it?
Yes.
To lend support to these thin walls. Remember that Eva was saying the walls are now very thin because there's a maximum of window space. Therefore, they're not as solid as they might be. They have to hold the weight of the roof up, and that's where the flying buttress comes in.
Yes. Very important also that the walls were thin and strong, because it allowed to have beautiful rose windows inserted in the walls. Rose windows are very beautiful visually, but they also tell stories. It's like reading a book. One rose window would tell a story from the Old Testament, for example. Another rose window would be telling story from the New Testament, and so on.
This beautiful visual setting was the home of a new kind of music, called the Notre Dame School, because the style evolved here. It took the single-line melody known as plain song, and first sang it with two parallel voices, then added a bass line, and now we can hear the beginnings of the music that we are familiar with. One of the characters most associated with Notre Dame is the Hunchback, or the Hunchback of Notre Dame, so named because of the book that Victor Hugo wrote in, I think it was 1832. The reason he wrote the book is quite interesting. The cathedral was actually falling into disrepair, and there was even a suggestion that maybe it should be torn down and something a little more recent built in its place. To show how important the cathedral was, he wrote his book. It became an immediate bestseller, and the government decided that after all they shouldn't tear the cathedral down, and they went ahead and repaired it.
But before that, Napoleon wanted to be crowned there at this very important symbolic French building. So he wanted to be crowned there as an emperor in 1804. Therefore, this building had to be fixed a little bit, but not enough to be used again as a church.
As we're making our way up to the roof then, up all these steps, let me tell you about the bees of Notre Dame. On the Notre Dame sacristy, adjacent to the cathedral, is a small hive of bees. It was put there in, I think, 7 years ago, 2013, and their honey is made from the flowering plants in the nearby gardens. There are a lot of gardens around the cathedral. The honey that is made is given away to the poor. So we've reached the roof, and once again we meet Eugène Viollet-le-Duc.
This is the architect who installed the spire, which burned recently, but also 12 apostles. And just like Abbot Suger, he decided to have his face there. So one of the apostles, St. Thomas, is his self-portrait.
By the way, the statues of the 12 apostles on the roof there survived the fire for the simple reason that they had been removed just a few days earlier for restoration. And even more important, maybe, the bees survived as well, so they are still producing their honey. One fascinating little point here, just in front of the door of Notre Dame, is set in the ground, is this indication of point zero of the roads of France. Any road going away from Paris to wherever, to Orléans, for example, is measured from this point, and there'll be an equivalent point, of course, in all cities. This is the famous one.
And it was placed there in 1924.
Oh, is it really?
Yes.
I didn't know that. Well, now I know it.
And you can hardly see it because there are so many tourists in front of the cathedral.
Those grotesques that we saw perched high up on the tower of Notre Dame, what are they looking at? Well, one of the things is the university called the Sorbonne University.
The school actually began at Notre Dame in 1170, and it was moved later by the king who built the wall. We just look at the wall, the King Philip Auguste, and later it became University of Paris. The university is a medieval invention.
So our university is part of the Dark Ages before the Renaissance?
First of all, you can't call the Middle Ages, just before the Renaissance, the Dark Ages. As you remember, there's wonderful Gothic architecture was invented. And even today, architects marvel how at that time structures like that could be built without computer simulations and so on. And now we have universities. Most of the European universities were born in the Middle Ages, including the Sorbonne.
Classes at the Sorbonne had students who might be as young as 10 years old. Sometimes they were mature students. There was not this restriction of age like today you'd expect students to be 18 to 22. The books they had, now of course this is before printing press was invented, so any reference book, they'd have to print it out by hand. If there were 20 or 30 students in a class, you'd need 20 or 30 copies. Here's an example, fascinating, beautifully written book with illustrations in the margins. This is the library at the Sorbonne. It may look as though it doesn't have too many books, but the system is that you decide what you want to read, you tell the librarian, and the librarian will bring the book to you.
There is a little guy here running with a violin. This must be you.
I was always late, so I always had to run, yes.
But you spent many hours there studying diligently.
Studying, yes. Very close to Notre Dame, and still on the island, there is this gem which very few people know about. The tourists go to Notre Dame, but they don't seem to notice that there is this Sainte-Chapelle hidden between government buildings.
So it looks very small and inconspicuous, but if you walk inside...
Inside, it looks like a jewellery box.
It's supposed to look like that. In a way, it's a reliquary.
It housed a collection of religious relics, and it was built in the 13th century by King Saint Louis. I said built by the king, but in fact, of course, it was built by master masons, and the architect of the Sainte-Chapelle is unknown.
Unknown, yes, but another medieval genius. The upper chapel is made of 618 square meters of glass.
And they depict 1,130 biblical figures. All this glass was restored and cleaned at the beginning of 2000. Parisian smog. When we were there in 2014, it was still under renovation, but we were able to go in and look at it anyway.
I was there in mid-90s, in July, and surprise, surprise, I was there alone. I was able to just sit on the floor and listen to Gregorian chant, and it was just an unforgettable experience.
Just down the road from the University of the Sorbonne is the Hôtel de Cluny. I have to admit that although I walked past this, going to the Sorbonne, almost every day for many years, I never been in. Ever. Have you been in?
Oh, of course, this is one of the best museums in Paris.
Oops.
Another very similar, excellent museum is in New York called the Cloisters.
In that case, next time we go to Paris, I will
Definitely
make a point of going in.
Definitely.
The Hôtel de Cluny is partially constructed on the remains of Gallo-Roman baths, which date from the 3rd century. They're known as the Thermes de Cluny,
which are famous in their own right and which can still be visited.
The building became a museum of medieval art in 1843. It holds a very large collection of medieval artifacts. Certainly the most significant objects are a group of medieval ages tapestries known as the Lady and the Unicorn.
It's also called sometimes the Mona Lisa of the Middle Ages or a national treasure of France.
It's decorative, but it's also practical.
Of course, it insulated the walls of those vast, cold castles.
These tapestries were woven from wool and silk, and these 5 we're looking at each depict one of the senses. By the way, to give you an idea of the size of these tapestries, here are a couple of figures standing in front. The 6th tapestry remains more of a mystery with its text, "À mon seul désir," which is actually very difficult to translate. Literally, it means "to my only desire." It's interpreted most frequently as a declaration of independence or purity.
In fact, we don't know. Probably at that time the symbolism of this image was understood, but today there's too many interpretations and we don't really know what it means.
Here's an interesting trivia for you. The cost of these tapestries was far more than Michelangelo was paid to paint the Sistine Chapel, for example. By the way, for anyone who's thinking, hotel, we'll stay there when we go to Paris, the word hôtel in French has 2 meanings. Certainly you get the Hilton Hotel, but in this case, hotel, it's more affiliated with the word hostel in English. It actually means a private house. I'm afraid you can't go and stay there. Let's take a moment to talk about Christine de Pizan. She was raised at court in Paris, the court of King Charles V. She was with her father, Thomas de Pizan, who was the secretary to the king.
She became the first woman in France, and possibly Europe, to earn a living by writing.
She was widowed after 10 years of marriage, and she took up writing in order to support herself and her 3 young children.
Her first poems were ballads of lost love written to the memory of her husband. Her 2 most famous works are The Tale of the Rose and The Book of the City of Ladies.
The Tale of the Rose was a polemic on the extremely popular book by Jean de Meun called Romance of the Rose, which was a work about courtly love that characterized women as seducers, and Pizan claimed it was misogynistic and simply slanderous to women. Here's a puzzle for you. What are we looking at here? Is this a scene which has been recorded in the countryside around Paris, or are we looking at something a little more central? Here's the answer. It's actually in the heart of Paris. This illustration is taken from a book which is called The Très Riche Heures du Duc Berry, and what it was is it was a book of hours. Now, a book of hours is a book which contains prayers. It's a collection of prayers and a collection of times as well when you should be saying those prayers. What we're looking at then is Louvre Castle. The castle itself doesn't exist anymore, or at least, no, I have to qualify that. It largely doesn't exist anymore. What does still exist is the foundations. The foundations include the support for the drawbridge that would have been at the front. This is all part of the courtyard, which is probably the less well-known part of the Louvre. You see there's a fountain playing there. Now, if we could switch that off, then you would see, if we would go down here and go through the arch, this is the now well-known part of the Louvre. At one point, about 30 years ago, it was decided that the entrance to the Louvre would be covered with a glass pyramid. The pyramid is rising towards the sky, and shortly after this, they decided they would add a pyramid which is going down into the depths, which you can only see once you've descended into the entrance of the Louvre.
So the Louvre is the biggest museum in the world. I believe it would take 100 days to see every piece of art, provided you spend only about 30 seconds in front of each.
Is that why they provide little buggies that you can drive around in?
Do they?
I do just want to add one comment on this. I know the French liked this combination, and in general, they like this combination of the old, the Louvre, and the extremely modern, the look of a pyramid, which is made in glass. I like the pyramid in glass, but I don't think it goes with the Louvre. It's a dichotomy which, for me, just doesn't marry.
If I can add my comment, the best part of the Louvre is the foundation.
Oh, I think you're just biased about medieval architecture.
Maybe I am. Maybe I am a descendant of the Gothic tribe.
The most famous museum in the world is fittingly home to one of the most famous paintings in the world.
That painting, of course, is Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci.
And judging by the crowds we can see here, it's pretty much the only reason to go to the Louvre.
Probably for most tourists.
Da Vinci began painting the Mona Lisa about 1503, and it was in his studio when he died 16 years later in 1519. The French king, Francis I, in whose court Leonardo spent the last years of his life, acquired the work after the artist's death, and it became part of the royal collection. The identity of La Gioconda is a mystery. After all these centuries, nobody has really been able to work out who she is. However, there is an entry in the, I believe it's in the Encyclopedia Britannica, isn't it?
Yes.
Which says the following: "It is not 100% certain who the mysterious woman was. But according to a study using emotion recognition software, we at least know that her enigmatic smile is 83% happy." I think that's really important to know, isn't it? It's probably the most important thing to know, isn't it? Francis I is the father of the French Renaissance.
Then his mother, Louise of Savoy, must be the grandmother of the movement.
Louise... Very funny. Louise was a widow with 2 children, and she was only 19 years old. She made sure that her son Francis, who was going to be the king, got a good education.
Well, behind every successful man there is a woman.
So, pardon?
I think.
This portrait of Francis I by Jean Clouet is one of the masterpieces of Renaissance portraiture. The traditional signs of royalty were dispensed with, but to show that this is royalty, there are crowns painted in the red damask behind the figure. His patronage extended to many artists, but most famously, of course, it was Da Vinci. He wasn't just a patron of visual art, he was also a great patron of literature. In 1537, at the age of 43, he proclaimed that any book that was sold in France had to have a copy reserved for his own personal library.
I hope he read them all.
Charles Lebrun.
Have you ever heard about him?
Actually, I have to confess I had never heard about him until you told me about him.
Well, I didn't know about him either. He is not really in the art history books, and in all those courses I took, he was never mentioned. And yet, he was the most important, the most famous painter in the 17th century France. So he imposed his own style of painting on all the artists in France who wanted to be officially recognized.
And this style served the monarchy very well because it needed some expressive propaganda. He was painter to the king for many years. He was elected director of the newly founded academy, and after a few years he even became its chancellor. This style, it was called the Louis XIV style. It was very grandiose, and because of it, Paris became the artistic capital of Europe. His great passion was physiognomy, and he did hundreds of drawings where he compared the features of animals to humans. And indeed, his series sparked a particular interest in facial characteristics and the connection between human characteristics and animal characteristics. As the preferred painter of King Louis XIV, he drew, of course, many portraits of the king.
In a very grandiose style, especially this equestrian portrait, the king looks like a Roman emperor.
Louis XIV became king when he was just 4 years old. His father, Louis XIII, knowing he was dying, decided to make his son king. And becoming king so young meant that his reign was actually the longest of any sovereign in Europe. He reigned for, 72 years?
And 110 days.
110 days. Wow. By the way, his father, Louis XIII, was the king who introduced wigs as a fashion. And it was a fashion that really took hold for 200 years.
Fascinating. One introduced the wigs, another introduced red shoes. Big influence on men's fashion. By the way, Louis XIV owned over 1,000 wigs.
He had an oversized ego, didn't he? Louis XIV was fashion crazy all his life. One of the things he liked particularly were shoes. Well, actually red shoes, red heels on shoes. He liked them so much that he reserved them for royalty, and if you were just a person in the street, you were not allowed to wear red heels.
You could be punished.
You could, yes.
Put in jail.
You could, of course, quite right. Put in jail for wearing red heels. And here's a nice little trivia for you. There was a French explorer called René Robert Cavelier. In 1682, I think it was, he was exploring in what is now the United States, and he claimed the land around the Mississippi River in the name of Louis XIV. And that is why that area is now called Louisiana. From a very young age, Louis had been trained in dance. And by the time this portrait was painted, he was already a very accomplished dancer and about to make his, almost a professional debut as a ballet dancer. It was 2 years later, when he was 16 years old, that he took part in a ballet with probably his most famous role. He took the part of the sun, that is the rising sun, and his costume was all in orange and gold colors. He managed, even at the age of 16, to make a big political statement of this. As the sun, of course, he was worshipped on stage, and he managed to translate that into offstage etiquette as well, so that the court in his reign reflected the actions that were happening during the ballet. He was called the Sun King, probably because of this role that he took in the ballet when he was 16. Let's see a short extract from it. At first, Louis XIV lived in Paris, lived at the Louvre, but the population of Paris did not like him.
In fact, hated him.
Hated him indeed. He decided then that he would move to Versailles,
which used to be his private hunting lodge, but he transformed it into a monumental palace.
The transformation became a symbol of absolute monarchy, but it still stands today as one of the wonderful buildings of France. The gardens also were transformed, and for the first time we find French gardens.
As opposed to English gardens, which were quite wild, the French gardens were carefully designed. For example, they had hidden grottos, they had dancing fountains, the flower beds were designed, color coordinated, and so on.
And these marvels still exist. We can still go and visit the Versailles Gardens. One of the most amazing rooms in the palace is the Hall of Mirrors. It's a marvel of architecture, of beauty.
And intimidation. We mustn't forget that the diplomats, the courtiers, anyone who would like to see the king has to go through that room and admire all those costly, luxurious mirrors.
intimidating because this is luxury. It was very expensive to put together. There are almost 360 mirrors which are reflecting light so that even if there are only a few people in the room, it looks like there's a big crowd of people.
It was made to impress. One of the most brilliant artists of the 18th century was Antoine Watteau. He had a great impact on the development of Rococo art in France.
The Rococo style emphasizes grace and beauty. It's light-hearted, even frivolous. Usually shows subjects like aristocrats at play or strolling or listening to music or flirting. Watteau was one of the first to choose his own subjects.
Remember that before that we had portraits or historic paintings or religious scenes depicted.
Amorous encounters create a mood for this painting, but they don't actually tell a story in the traditional sense. There was no category for this type of painting. It was new. So a new term was invented, fête galante. There's no really good translation for fête galante. I would translate it as amorous festivities. This painting inspired some very lovely piano music at the beginning of the 20th century. In 1904, Claude Debussy wrote a solo piano piece. Now, he entitled it the Joyful Isle, l'Île Joyeuse. In the 1940s, another French composer, Francis Poulenc, wrote a piece for two pianos. It was actually written for a film score. Poulenc entitled his piece L'Embarcation pour Citer. We've moved forward now to the 18th century, and we'll start with Elisabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun.
She showed this self-portrait with her daughter Julie at a prestigious Paris salon. Actually, it was shocked because her lips are parted in a demure smile.
Appalling. That is shocking because it ignores the rules about facial representation. There are rules to these things, and she's going against the rules. And the idea of a smile where you can see the teeth, that's fine if this is a public house where people are drunk, but certainly not for a portrait like this.
Yeah, the drunkard musicians at a tavern somewhere. It was very popular in Dutch painting, but not in a portrait of a mother and child.
I'm not sure I like you putting drunkards and musicians in the same sentence.
Musicians in a tavern.
There we go. Oh, never. She was born in Paris. Her family was certainly not rich. It was she had humble beginnings. Her father was a portraitist. He did pastel portraits, and he certainly noticed that his daughter was a talented artist from a very young age. Unfortunately, he died while she was
only 12. And later she took a few courses with some artists in Paris, but basically she was self-taught.
And by the time she was in her late teens, she was essentially already a professional artist.
Very talented.
To the extent that at one point the authorities closed her studio because she was a professional and yet she was not a member of a guild. And in order to be a painter, she had to be a member of a guild. So they came and closed her studio.
And probably she didn't apply because it's possible that as a woman she could be refused to become a member of the guild. But she had a great career.
Her fame as a portrait artist grew quite rapidly, and indeed very soon, in the early 1780s, she came to the notice of the Queen, Marie Antoinette.
And she became her official portrait painter.
Here we see a portrait of Marie Antoinette. She's glamorous for sure, but she's not royally glamorous.
Not a stiff imperial pose. She looks quite natural. One of the art critics said that her sitters are glamorously natural and naturally glamorous.
So she wanted to re-image royalty to make them look more natural and maybe closer to the general populace. Unfortunately, it was too late for the Queen, wasn't it?
It was way too late.
It's interesting that with the prevailing views at the time, the general consensus was that she was not the one doing her paintings, or at least if she started them, some professional finished them for her.
Well, she survived all this criticism
And she was quite old, wasn't she, when she died? She
died at 86.
86.
In Paris,
yeah.
a very successful painter and a very successful businesswoman.
This painting by David of the oath taken by the three brothers to their father is a new departure, and it heralds a style which became called neoclassicism.
It's a rather austere composition, quite static, especially the women in the background. They look like a Roman frieze from ancient Roman sculpture.
It's interesting, isn't it, that there's almost two parts, two separate stories here. You have the males on the left side, a very dynamic stance, and the women on the right with their despairing stance.
Oh, they know that whatever the outcome, someone will be killed, and that would be tragic.
It was important at that time for the neoclassical artists to show the ancient values such as stoicism, self-sacrifice, duty, patriotism. David was a very patriotic painter, and he was involved in the French Revolution that was brewing. The French people had come to feel that royalty had too many privileges and that life in the streets had become unbearable. The revolution, therefore, overthrew the monarchy and tried to establish a republic. This picture, then, The Death of Marat, shows him in his bath. He has just been assassinated by Charlotte Corday. Politically, she was an enemy of Marat, and she blamed him for a lot of the massacres that had been happening. She gained entrance to his rooms and presented him with a letter in which she detailed a lot of counter-revolutionary activity. She gave him the note then. Then she produced a knife that she'd hidden in her bodice and fatally stabbed him. There's an interesting predecessor in Michelangelo's Pietà. You remember that in this sculpture, Michelangelo shows the body of Jesus in his mother's lap, and his right arm is hanging down limply towards the ground, just as Marat has his arm in this picture. David was a great admirer of Caravaggio, and you'll also find in the Entombment of Christ this same attitude. There's the dead body which is being lowered into the tomb, and the right arm is already hanging limply, pointing down to the ground. By 1794, the French Revolution had pretty much run its course. The aristocrats, the royalty, had been beheaded, and the revolutionaries had even turned on themselves, and they were starting to execute other revolutionaries. Since David was sympathetic to the revolution, they turned on him. He was actually imprisoned and in peril of being executed. He was saved from execution by the new kid on the block, one Napoleon, who recognized David's talents as a painter and also recognized that David could serve Napoleon. Napoleon refused to pose for this portrait, so David had to use his son sitting on a wooden horse to create the painting. Indeed, Napoleon only gave David one instruction. He said the painting should be calm on a fiery horse.
And a funny fact, there was no horse at all, because Napoleon crossed the Alps on a small mule. Another great example of imperial propaganda.
Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres was a student of David. His teacher glorified Napoleon, and Ingres did the same. He used furniture and attire and the setting to transform Napoleon from somebody who's just mortal to the representation of a powerful god.
Napoleon here sits on a very imposing imperial throne.
It's actually a similar throne to the one that Van Eyck painted in his Ghent altarpiece. And in the Van Eyck painting, it is God sitting on the throne.
By the way, the altarpiece was at that time at the Louvre.
And the Louvre, I believe, at that time was called the Napoleon Museum, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
The Musée Napoléon.
There are many elements here associated with the divine, with the imperial.
For example, the imperial eagle can be seen on the carpet and also on the armrest. He is wearing a gilded laurel wreath, which is a sign of victory and authority. In his left hand, he's holding a rod which is topped with the hand of justice.
And in his right hand, he's holding a scepter of Charlemagne.
Charlemagne was crowned the first emperor of the Romans almost 1,000 years earlier.
He's wearing purple.
It was a long tradition that the colour purple was reserved for imperial use.
It's also huge. It's a huge painting. Anyone standing in front of it would be dwarfed by its size.
I think it's 8.5 feet by 5.5 feet. In every way, Ingres made him larger than life, and I imagine that Napoleon approved of this portrait.
We cannot accuse him of modesty.
Ingres was quite a prodigy.
He was only 16 when he won the very prestigious prize for drawing, and he also won Prix de Rome, one of the most important awards given by the French Academy.
At first, nothing seems unusual about this painting. It's just a very good painting of a nude.
And yet it is unusual. I think, first of all, what you notice is the importance of line. Her body looks elongated.
It looks almost as though she has extra vertebrae down her back.
So she looks very elegant, but it's not anatomically correct.
What we see here is linearity, which was very important for all neoclassical artists. Eugène Delacroix was almost contemporary with Ingres. He was, I believe, 20 years younger, and yet he represents an entirely different school of painting.
At that time, there were two schools of painting, neoclassical and romantic. Ingres and David, of course, represented neoclassical school, and Delacroix, the most important painter of French Romanticism.
And we even have a photograph of Delacroix, which was taken when he was 59 years old. 1 year after Delacroix painted his own self-portrait, he painted a portrait of the composer Frédéric Chopin.
Frédéric Chopin actually wasn't a French composer, he was a Polish composer, but he had to leave the country for political reasons.
So he found himself in Paris, and he became very much a part of the French musical scene. Here's one of what must be the most famous of French paintings by Delacroix. It is called Liberty Leading the People.
It's a historic painting, although it was completed the same year the event occurred in 1830.
At first view it looks chaotic, but actually it's very carefully balanced.
And of course, every person here is symbolic.
So, for example, if you look at the left, there's the guy holding the sword. He's dressed like a factory worker, so the lower strata of society was very much involved in the revolution.
I think maybe we should start with the lady, the half-naked lady, waving a flag. You wouldn't expect a half-naked woman running around with a weapon. Of course, she wasn't there. She is the symbol of liberty.
And we can see that actually through the hat she's wearing. It's a Phrygian cap, traditionally given to slaves when they were freed as a mark of their freedom. It's interesting that Delacroix put two flags in this painting. The obvious one, of course, in the middle there that the lady is waving, but there's another one which is up here, tiny little flag on the top of Notre Dame. Notre Dame is a symbol of Paris. And notice also how the guy who is on his hands and knees at the feet of liberty reflects the colors. He is wearing a cummerbund, which is bright red, like the flag. He's wearing a jacket, which is blue, like the flag.
Let's come back to the man standing to the left.
Oh yeah, I was talking about the factory worker, the lower strata of society. Next to him is somebody who very obviously is from the upper echelons of society. Notice the gun that he's holding. Very significant. It's not a weapon of war. It's actually a hunting gun. This is underlining the fact that he is not somebody who would have been in the army or somebody who was expected to be fighting. He's come along with whatever he had, which was his gentleman's hunting gun. This is a revolution for everyone.
And what is the young boy doing there?
The young boy, actually there are two young boys. There's one to the left who looks like he's tripped over the barricade and is about to get himself to his feet again. But the one we all know, of course, is the one just by the lady on the right there, waving two guns. Very significant. What Delacroix was telling us here is that the revolution was for everybody. Children were very much involved in the fight as well. This painting has become a symbol of French Romanticism.
And a symbol of revolution.
Delacroix versus Ingres.
Romanticism versus neoclassicism.
Which is, of course, line versus colour. Here's a painting by Joseph Danhauser. It's probably better known to musicians than to artists. The painting is entitled Liszt at the Piano. Ferenc Liszt was a Hungarian pianist, universally considered to be the finest pianist of his day. In this group you can see Dagout, a lady who is sitting at Liszt's feet. Although she was married to Charles-Louis Constant Dagout, she actually had 3 children with Liszt. These are the romantic times, remember. The lady sitting in the armchair, dressed like a man, smoking a cigar, doing everything a man would do. She went by the name of Georges Sand, which was the pen name of Amantine Lucille Aurore Dupin. She was a novelist. Interestingly, she was one of the most well-known writers in Europe in her lifetime, much more so than Victor Hugo, who is better remembered today. Next to her is the writer Dumas. You might not know the name Dumas, but you certainly know at least 2 of the novels he wrote, The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. The musicians are standing in a little group at the back there. First there is Berlioz, Hector Berlioz, who was the most well-known French composer in his day, and history has remembered him as one of the great French composers. Next to him is Niccolò Paganini, whose music was supposed to have been inspired by the devil. Indeed, some people in his audience said that they could see the devil standing by Paganini, moving his bow for him. Next to Paganini stands Rossini. He's an interesting character. He wrote about 40 operas. He wrote the last one, William Tell, when he was about 35 years old. And after that, for the last 40 years or so of his life, he did not write another opera. On the table, somebody who really doesn't need any introduction at all, Beethoven. Probably the only composer whose name can be brought to mind just by playing 4 notes. And finally, sitting at the piano, Liszt. He was the greatest pianist of his day, and many would say the greatest pianist, period. Apart from writing his own original compositions, he did a lot of pieces called transcriptions. What he did would be to take music written by another composer, and then he would either just use the melody or the melody and the harmony, and he would make his own piece of music from that.
I think this is a good place to take a break.
We'll see you back in part 2 of Bonjour Paris.